Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, the Timberwolves bench trio continues to impress, continues to astound. We'll talk about just how impressive the numbers are. Any unit that includes the bench trio of Naz Reid, Donte DiVincenzo, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and also might the Wolves start to play small more often? And could the upcoming trade deadline have anything to do with that? We'll talk about all that and more today on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Tuesday, everybody. This is the final show of the year 2024. Believe it or not, it's New Year's Eve. The Wolves take on the OKC Thunder tonight. Of course, the best in the West and one of the very best in the entire NBA to close out the 2024 calendar year, which has been a ton of fun. And if the Wolves weren't in the middle of playing every other day, maybe I'd do like a bigger, more grand best moments of the calendar year. Maybe I'll do that. They have a little bit of a break here in the next couple of weeks, but it should be a lot of fun tonight, too. We'll talk a little Wolves Thunder toward the end. A lot to get to first, so I want to talk lineups today. I want to talk about the bench trio that I've spent a lot of time on recently, but Chris Finch has been trying some different players around those three. We saw a lot of Josh Minott the other, I shouldn't say a lot, more Josh Minott that we've seen all season on Sunday against the Spurs and going back to Friday against Houston. And also Jack Borman and I talked on the postcast the other day about a potential post-trade deadline lineup if Julius Randle were to be moved in February or before February, perhaps. But, you know, what that could mean. I mean, might we see Chris Finch play smaller lineups here in the short term? So a lot to get to. We'll start with the bench, then we'll get into the lineup stuff, and we'll close with some Western Conference stuff and a bit of a Thunder preview as well. So a big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. You can watch on YouTube. You can also download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV and watch there. A reminder, we've got a daily newsletter now. You can subscribe at lockedondaily.com and would be much obliged if you would subscribe and check out that newsletter every day, Monday through Friday. It's one stop for ultimate team and league coverage. Would love to shoot up the rankings in our team newsletters. We're having a bit of a competition at Locked On. So if you do listen to this podcast regularly, or even if you don't, be awesome if you subscribed, and much appreciated. Again, that's at lockedondaily.com. Subscribe to the Locked On Wolves newsletter. All right. So I did a couple of shows last week about the Timberwolves bench trio, and I don't want to rehash, I don't want to just straight rehash what I talked about last week or the week before, but I do want to reiterate that the numbers continue to just be off the charts, impressive for the bench, and also somewhat damning and, not positive, we'll say, for the Timberwolves starters as a unit. And it's been like this all season, and that's kind of how we looked at it last week. But Sunday was just a almost an anecdotal, obviously a painfully small sample, 1 game sample of what I mean by all of this and what we've seen over the course of the first 31 games so far this season. Sunday, we saw the Timberwolves starters come out and get the Wolves in a 10-point hole very quickly against the Spurs. The bench unit started to come in midway through, actually a little bit later than usual, later into the first quarter, and almost immediately righted the ship. They went on a 10-0 run in the second quarter, and almost always, there's at least one starter on the floor with the quote-unquote bench unit. Usually it's two, because Chris Finch has, for the most part, kept a pretty tight 8-man rotation with an occasional 9th man. The first few games it was Joe Ingles, and then there was some brief Josh Dillingham moments. There's more recently it's been Josh Minott, and sometimes it was only 8 guys. And so usually there'd be 2 starters with the 3 bench guys. Of course, Naz Reid, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and Donte DiVincenzo. In this game, it was a 4-man bench unit, which included Josh Minott and the aforementioned bench trio. And then Julius Randle was that 5th guy who fit with that unit well. And I've been saying for a long time, I'm not the only one, so I'm not taking credit for this, but I have been saying on the show since the trade that staggering Julius Randle and Anthony Edwards minutes as much as possible makes the most sense, because both of those guys, when they're on the floor, the offense is revolving around them and learning how to play off one another, because Julius isn't the catch and shoot threat that Cat is. because he's not as, I'll call him, as smooth of an offensive player as Karl-Anthony Towns. Yes, he's effective. Yes, he can play bully ball. Yes, he can punish mismatches. Yes, he can shoot the three. He gets the line better than Cat. He can pass better than Cat, even if we haven't really seen that yet in a Wolves uniform. It's just less synergistic to try and fit Randle and Ant together than it ever was with Cat and Ant. And by the way, it's not like it was always super smooth with Cat and Ant. It took a while to figure it out, which is yet another reason why it's not surprising the offense has been clunky, to put it kindly, over the first 31 games of the season. We've seen fits and starts because it is hard to have two guys that want to and need to and are used to being the focal point of an offense play together. So all that aside, it is what it is. We're 31 games into this thing, and Randle, it might be a one and done, right? There's always a chance they trade him by the deadline. We'll talk more about that later. There's a decent chance he moves on in free agency in the offseason. There's also the chance he picks up his player option. Then the Wolves say, like, look, we got to try and trade him now that he's picked up this option because he doesn't fit into our plans next year, right? So there's a wide variety of things that can happen here over the next few weeks, next several weeks, and really next 6 months-ish, related to Julius Randle. But back to the lineup stuff. We've seen the Timberwolves try this bench trio with different combinations of additional guys. Let's just look at, as a whole, that three-man bench trio of DiVincenzo, Reid, and Alexander-Walker together. All of those lineups through 31 games, 877 possessions. They're a 97th percentile three-man unit. 97th percentile, a plus 14.4 differential in 877 possessions. That's a differential based on 100 possessions, both on offense and defense, according to Cleaning the Glass. It's a 77th percentile offensive unit with those three and a 97th percentile defensive unit. But the most important number is in nearly 900 possessions. It's a 97th percentile overall unit. I don't really care how they get there. In fact, I even pulled minutes out with Rudy Gobert just to kind of see how it looks. And if you take Rudy Gobert out of the equation, so they played 877 total minutes together. Just over half of that is with Rudy Gobert. But if you take Rudy off the floor, this is still a 96th percentile three-man unit in 421 possessions. The defense is much worse. It's 68th percentile, which still is, that'll play, right? 68th percentile. But the offense is 98th percentile. So with Rudy on the floor, this is a defense-first unit that is still well above average in the 70s percentile-wise offensively. But with Rudy off the floor, which is almost half the time that these three guys are on the floor together, with essentially with Naz at the 5 and some combination of Julius or Jaden or Josh Minott even more recently at the 4, this is a 96th percentile unit, and they're doing it with offense. 98th percentile offensively, 124.9. So we'll call it 125 points per 100 possessions for this unit in 421 possessions. And the most used non-Rudy lineup with those three guys is with Anthony Edwards in the backcourt with Donte and Naz Reid in the front court with Julius Randle and Alexander-Walker at the 3. So they could do it in multiple ways, which I think is the takeaway here. They could do it with Rudy defensively with a little bit less pace and more dribble handoff actions, more spread pick and roll with Donte and Rudy, and sometimes Ant's on the floor in these units as well with Rudy, and then you're seeing a lot more pick and roll. Or you could take Rudy off the court. They could do it with pace. They could do it with, attacking the rim in transition, putting pressure on the defense that way, trail threes from Donte and from Naz and from Randle. Randle attacking with more space with no Rudy on the floor. These three players together have shown the ability to play in a variety of different ways with or without Rudy Gobert, which, as we all know, and I've been pushing this now for over a year. I said this last year. The Timberwolves don't take enough advantage of playing in transition when Rudy's off the floor. When he's on the floor, sure, slow it down. Try and get your half-court defense set as much as possible and slow down your offense as well to kind of play to those strengths. When Rudy's off the floor, push the pace. You have athletes, you have shooters. These lineups without Rudy on the floor, every single time, you've got league average and above shooters. Jaden's the only guy, and you could say Josh Minott because we haven't seen it yet consistently. Those are the only two guys that aren't league average or better from 3 for their career, right? This most used lineup with no Rudy, with those 3, Ant, DiVincenzo, Alexander-Walker, Randle, Reid, those dudes were all, and Randle was had a down year last year percentage-wise, but just a couple years ago, he's 40%. Those are all, 38 plus 3-point percent shooting guys, basically. So you could do it with pace. You can do it with space with Rudy off the floor, or you could play like Rudy likes to play, and you're still a 97th percentile unit with Rudy on the floor, 96 with Rudy off the floor overall when you're taking the thing in its totality as a three-man bench trio. That says a lot about just how impressive those three have been together. I want to hit on something Jack Borman and I talked about on the postcast. If you watch the postcast on Locked On Sports Minnesota, Sunday night we went live, myself and Jack Borman, who does the postcast almost after almost every single Wolves game. And then it's also on the audio feed. So it was before my Monday episode. You'll find it in your audio feed. Jack and I got briefly toward the end. We talked a little. Jack mentioned a lineup that perhaps we see post-trade deadline. I want to dig in a bit more on that and talk about something we could see, something to kind of try and read the tea leaves on here over the next several weeks as we draw closer to the trade deadline. We'll close by talking about the Timberwolves' upcoming schedule, where they sit in the West, the pace that they're playing at as a team in terms of their ultimate win total, where that could land them in the West. And we'll briefly talk Wolves Thunder, who we'll see play each other tonight in OKC. It's all upcoming here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by Rocket RX. If you're ready to boost your confidence and take control of the bedroom, Rocket RX has the solution. Imagine feeling more prepared and performing at your best. Rocket RX makes it simple and stress-free. Rocket RX offers FDA-approved treatments for erectile dysfunction at a lower cost than branded alternatives. No more uncomfortable doctor visits or pharmacy trips. Everything is delivered straight to your door in discreet, plain packaging. With Rocket RX, you'll get trusted care from a real U.S. clinical team. Complete a quick 100% online consultation. You could get your free prescription today. Visit rocketrx.com to get started now. It only takes 2 minutes. Right now, our listeners can get 40% off your first order when you use the code LOCKEDONNBA. That's rocketrx.com, code LOCKEDONNBA for 40% off your first order. Terms and conditions apply. Rocket RX, better sex made simple. All right, a quick mid-show reminder to subscribe to Locked On Wolves newsletter at LockedOnDaily.com. You'll get that email every day, Monday through Friday, and promise will be worth your while. Between the write-ups from this show and then also a couple times a week, we get some national content as well. So go check that out at LockedOnDaily.com. All right. So Jack and I on Sunday after the game on the postcast, we talked a little bit about a potential smaller ball. It's not really a small ball lineup, but compared to how the Wolves have traditionally played with Rudy Gobert in the fold, a potential smaller lineup that the Wolves could play, especially if they want to consider what things could look like post-trade deadline if Julius Randle is indeed moved. Now, I don't want to be a prisoner of the moment too much in the sense that the Wolves have won 3 in a row. The vibes are suddenly much better. They did just lose 3 in a row. But on the flip side, as Jack said at the end of the postcast on Sunday, I don't look now like even with that 3-game losing streak, this Timberwolves team is on a much better trajectory than they were, call it a month ago, right? Like Thanksgiving week, they're 8-10. The sky is somewhat falling. Like that's kind of what everybody's thinking, right? Well, they've now won 9 of their last 13. So 9-4 over their last 13, which is good, not like amazing, but pretty good. And also you look at the competition they played over that stretch, right? Golden State 3 times, the Lakers a couple of times, the Clippers a couple of times, the Knicks, the Mavs, Houston, San Antonio a couple of times. That's not like a super easy schedule. Like every single one of those teams is very likely to be a play-in team or better. They did lose to Atlanta mixed in. Atlanta's, I think, probably going to end up, they're right now top 5 in the East. So really, yeah, I think that statement holds. They're all playing or better teams, and to go 9-4 in that stretch with the booing at home and some of the stuff that happened along the way, that's, pretty good. So with a more macro view, I'm sure, we've talked about this a lot on the show in the wake of the trade, but I'm sure Tim Conley in the Timberwolves front office had eyes wide open with the possibility that the Randle thing really could kind of derail the season. And I'm sure was considering the possibility, hey, we should trade this dude, during the season or by the deadline because he's got that player option. He could opt in, or you could lose him for nothing in the offseason, or you end up paying him and potentially overpaying him. All three things are possibilities. I think that's the least likely one, the last one I mentioned. I came into this thing thinking it was most likely he left for nothing. But given the way the season's gone, there, like, the other two things are possible too. He may just opt in and be like, screw it, I'll get 30+ million to be here next year. Or the Timberwolves could be like, we got to get out of the Randle business as soon as possible because of, the boos and the all the clips that have gone viral of him and his demeanor on the court. The Timberwolves win a close game and he kind of saunters off. That's changed a little bit recently. And also part of that is just Julius. When I did the crossover episode with Locked On Knicks a week and a half ago, those guys said, look, he did that in New York too. Like, he just sometimes he has a Jaden McDaniels face, except for he kind of looks angrier than Jaden, right? Like, Jaden just looks like Jaden, and fair or unfair, Julius Randle has a bit more of a sullen demeanor about him and doesn't look excited, for his teammates at times, etc. So all that to say, if that's possible, and I would absolutely say it's possible. I'm not willing to put a percentage on it right now. I think it's probably still a little more likely than not they don't trade him. But it's certainly possible he's traded by the deadline, which, by the way, is like the second week of February. We're like within 6 weeks. I think it might be 6 weeks from tomorrow, actually, or today. So if he gets traded, and maybe perhaps this could be an indicator to look out for if you think that's a possibility, this small-ish ball lineup that the Timberwolves have been playing around with a little bit. And that's basically, not basically, it is the starters minus Randle plus Donte DiVincenzo, which it's still got Gobert at the 5, so it's not a true small ball lineup. McDaniels is 6, 8 or 9 or whatever he actually is, playing the 4. But Jaden McDaniels hasn't played the 4 since the Ryan Saunders year and the very first part of Chris Finch's tenure. He did it a little bit in Finch's first full year when they got the 6th seed and lost in 6 games to Memphis. Jaden played some 4. But since the Rudy trade, he's exclusively played the 3. Like, I think he's played a very small handful of minutes. And by that, I mean like 10 or 12 or 15 or something like that at the 4. He's been a 3 because the Wolves have leaned into playing big as their identity. But is this shifting? Is the multiple guard backcourt a thing we're going to see more of? Because the Wolves still, they want a point guard on the floor. And I talked about this on Monday's show, the postgame pod, toward the end. Like, they still don't have that true backup point guard. It's not Rob Dillingham. It's not going to be this year. Maybe next year. It's not this year. Last year, they traded for Monte Morris. That didn't really work out, although he was okay in a Wolves uniform. It never really, Finch clearly was never super comfortable with how that thing shook out. So it's Donte DiVincenzo, and it's Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and it's some combination of Ant and Randle running the offense when Conley's out on the floor. And Conley struggled. And in order to get Donte on the floor recently, it's been Conley losing minutes. But you still want Mike on the floor as much as you can. So against certain teams, could we see this starting lineup minus Randle plus DiVincenzo? So you essentially have a 3-guard backcourt with Mike, DiVincenzo, and Ant, and McDaniels on the wing and Gobert down low. That's still a pretty long lineup, albeit not tall, with Ant at the 3 and DiVincenzo and Conley together in the backcourt. But it's a long lineup, and it's a defensively active lineup, and it still could be it would be a very good defensive lineup. And depending on the opponent, probably better as a defensive lineup than one with Julius Randle, because you have the point of attack defensive capabilities and the ball pressure that Conley and DiVincenzo and Ant as a trio can provide, and McDaniels. Like, with that lineup, you can put Ant on, like, it depends on the matchup, because as I've noted before, it's no secret Ant gets up for high usage, star caliber type defensive assignments. He's better defensively when you put him in one of those spots than if you try and hide him, or not hide him, if you play him off the ball. It's a bit of a catch-22, because you play him off the ball to conserve energy and to not get him in foul trouble, whatever. They tried that in the playoffs some. But then he's a negative off the ball, because he doesn't usually, because the focus isn't there. The full court awareness isn't there. He tries to kind of take some plays off here and there, and I'm not like guys do that, right? But you put him on the ball, and he's literally one of the best on-ball defenders in the NBA. I truly believe that. So you have the option there with Ant. You could do either. Or you could put, more likely, you put Mike on the least threatening guard or wing for the opposing team. McDaniels and DiVincenzo handle the point of attack. You have Ant and Mike on the wings, and Gobert obviously either guarding a big or doing the roaming thing like he does when he guards Sohan, or most recently we saw that against the Spurs, where he can basically just kind of guard the paint and play off of the non-shooter, the non-offensive threat for the other team. So how often have we seen this lineup? This smaller lineup with McDaniels at the 4? Well, including the Spurs game, according to Cleaning the Glass, only 18 possessions this year. Conley, Edwards, DiVincenzo, McDaniels, and Gobert. 18 total possessions. So the sample size doesn't matter. Or I should say that. Sample size matters, which means these numbers we can take with gigantic grains of salt. However, I do want to point out in those 18 possessions, they're 100th percentile unit, 68.1, a plus 68.1. 100th percentile offensively, 100th percentile defensively. I think basically nearly all of them came in the Spurs game on Sunday. So we can't read too much into that. Jack noted in his notes from Sunday's game that that 5-man unit played for 6 minutes together in the second quarter. So actually that is probably about the totality that those 5 have played together this season. They played together for roughly half that second quarter, and they were a +8. They won those minutes 17-9 over the Spurs, and they were awesome defensively. Remember, the Spurs were stuck on 7 points for most of or 9 points, I guess, for most of the second quarter. So it's been a positive lineup. If we start to see that more, I think it's in part because of the improved play from Donte DiVincenzo. He now looks like the Donte from the Knicks versus the Donte from October, November of this year. And it might, maybe suggest, hint at possibility that Chris Finch that Tim Conley is saying, hey, Chris, the Randle trade is a real possibility. So start thinking about what a smaller lineup could look like depending on what we get back for Randle. Because if this is how we're going to get Conley and DiVincenzo on the floor together, we got to try this out. And then if McDaniels is in foul trouble, you could try the Josh Minott thing. I meant to talk more about Minott today. Didn't get into it, but there will be plenty of time. And I have spent a lot of time on Minott. But Minott is also the McDaniels foul trouble kind of security blanket there too with this unit. I don't think he takes anything away from you offensively. I actually think if given the opportunity, he'll be a better offensive player than McDaniels. He's not quite as good defensively, but the help side blocks, the rebounding, I think could be better. The activity's better off the ball than it is with McDaniels. So you lose a point of attack defender a little bit there. I shouldn't say lose. Minott's a good point of attack defender. He's not quite McDaniels, but he's a better off-ball defender. So that just kind of shuffles who's guarding the ball, right? Like Ant, it might be more Ant, Donte, or than Donte McDaniels in that case, right? But that 5-man with Minott in place of McDaniels in some instances, I think will be pretty intriguing. All right, let's close by talking about the standings, where the Wolves sit in the West, the pace they're playing at win-wise, and then we'll talk about Wolves Thunder, who we'll get to see tonight. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at Rocket Money. Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions that you forgot about, or maybe that you were paying for twice? That's definitely happened to many folks. It's easy to just have a few additional subscriptions you don't even realize you're paying for, but Rocket Money makes it easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals that you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all the app's premium features. One of the best features is absolutely the subscription tracker. Many people have used it to cancel services that they just don't use anymore. It can help you save a ton. Plus, with the goals feature, you can automatically set aside money for your future with no more stressing about budgeting every month. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. rocketmoney.com/lockedon. All right, let's close this thing out by quickly peeking in on the Western Conference standings. The Timberwolves are now 8th in the West. This is headed into play on Monday. So I'm recording this before Monday night games start. And actually, I don't know that a whole lot's going to change. I guess Denver plays Utah. They're probably not going to lose that game. Golden State, I guess, is behind the Wolves at the moment. Anyway, slightly, if they win, the Wolves will still be half game up. So I don't think this is changing much between now and when you listen to this. But The Wolves are a half game behind Denver for 7th. They're a full game behind the Clippers for 6th, which of course takes you out of the play-in in the West. And so far this year, the Wolves have already beaten the Clippers twice. So if they were to tie with the Clippers, as of now, they've still got, let's see, do they play them twice more or once more? They actually only play them once more. So they already have the tiebreaker locked up against the LA Clippers. So they're one game behind the Clippers, but if they tie the Clippers, they win that tiebreaker. They're a game behind the Lakers. They're 2-1 against the Lakers. So they have that tiebreaker too. So they're really only a game back of the 5 spot is another way to look at this, which obviously gets you clear of the play-in. It gets you in a matchup against the 4 seed, which in this case is Dallas, which isn't great. But like Houston's only a game up on Dallas for the 4. I think you'd rather play Houston than Dallas if you're the Wolves. Matchup-wise, I don't think there's any question. Pedigree-wise, in terms of the playoff experience and everything, you'd rather play Houston in the first round. It's silly to be talking about first-round matchups 31 games in, but I'm just pointing that out with the way things are currently. They're 1 game ahead of Golden State, who's in 9th. They're a game and a half ahead of San Antonio, who they're 2-1 against. They're in 10th. And Phoenix is 2 games back of the Wolves, and they're in 11th. So they're still only 2 games clear of missing the play-in altogether, which I don't like. It's obviously a thing that could happen, but it's not realistically a concern. But this, little 3-game winning streak and 9 wins in 13 games has been great for Minnesota to kind of stabilize in the West. And they're playing really well against good competition, right? They're 14-9 in the conference. They haven't played OKC yet. They haven't played Memphis yet. They've split a pair against Houston. They've lost to Dallas, or they beat Dallas the other day. They're 2-1 against the Lakers. They're 2-0 against the Clippers. I think they're 1-0 against Denver. So they're doing well against the good competition. It's the teams below them they've struggled with a little bit. Obviously, Portland being the most obvious one. They've lost to the Spurs. They've lost to the Warriors. And they haven't yet played Utah or New Orleans, but that's going to change soon. We'll talk more about that. Actually, let's talk about that now. Upcoming, you have OKC and Boston this week. Of course, OKC's 26-5. Cleveland is still 27-4 with the best record in the NBA, which is still nuts to me that they've been that good. And then they get Boston. So the Wolves get OKC and Boston this week. And then the schedule finally lightens up a little bit. Now, Detroit is currently in play-in position in the East. They're 14-18. They've struggled a little bit more lately. Obviously, a game the Wolves should still win. It'll be the first game they've played against a sub-500 team in quite some time. Like, you got to go all the way back to, I'm assuming San Antonio wasn't the last time they played him. You got to go all the way back to Toronto, who they lost to the Thursday before Thanksgiving. Unless I'm crazy. Atlanta's over 500 still. Yeah. I don't know. That's even, I knew this. I prepped this and I didn't stick out to me that was, 5 weeks ago. They haven't played a team below 500 since Toronto on November 21st. They get that with Detroit this coming Saturday at Detroit, where the Wolves have generally, of course, played well over the last few years, as they should. And then it's the Clippers next week at home. And then you go at New Orleans, at Orlando, which is obviously a tough game, despite their injuries. They're 20-14. And then home for Memphis, which is tough. Then at Washington. So you at least get New Orleans and Washington over the next 2+ weeks, or actually exactly 2 weeks. And but everything else in there is still tough. It's still a really tough schedule for Minnesota. So for them to have won 9 of the last 13 is pretty encouraging. And honestly, a split between at OKC and home for Boston this week would be great. And then hopefully winning your next 3 with Detroit, LA, and New Orleans, heading into Orlando and Memphis would be awesome too. Let's talk briefly about tonight and the matchup against the Thunder. Jack and I did a quick preview at the end of the postcast on Sunday as well. The Thunder are 16-2 since the Chet Holmgren injury, which is crazy. Isaiah Hartenstein, of course, missed the first part of the season with an injury that he had in preseason. And they're overall now, the Thunder are still, despite the injuries, 26-5. I don't think Chet Hartenstein have played together at all. They've kind of filled in for each other admirably. The question at the start of the year was, how would those two mesh and play together? That's still a question that hasn't been answered. And Chet will be back later this season, so that will be kind of the next test, I guess, to overcome for OKC, which seems like, if you get back a guy like Chet Holmgren, it's not a bad thing, but there could be a bit of a, like when Cat came back from the calf injury a couple years ago, there could be a reintegration, or in this case, I guess, integrations. They haven't actually played together, a period there for the Thunder. But Hartenstein's had the most opportunity of his career. He's been great. He's averaging a double-double in 30-plus minutes for OKC. He's never had that kind of runway in terms of playing time. And the key for Minnesota, of course, is just putting as much pressure as you can on Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, trying to force the ball out of his hands and make other people beat you. Now, Other people can beat you, as evidenced by the Thunder's incredible record this season. But if you can make somebody besides Shea do it, like, then you tip your cap, right? Jalen Williams is averaging 21 points a game. So he's not chopped liver. He's shooting 48% from the floor. He's 36% from three. He's a good player. But without him, it's Hartenstein and it's a bunch of guys who average single digits per game. Like Lou Dort is the next highest scorer, and he's under 10 points, 9.6 points per game. If you can make Lou Dort beat you and try and make him do stuff besides shoot threes, I mean, roughly three quarters of his shot attempts are threes. If you make him put the ball on the floor, try and beat you in other ways, that's best case scenario. Now, the Thunder turn teams over more than anybody else in the league. They're number one in turnover rate as a defense. The Wolves still turn it over way too much. The Wolves also foul way too much. OKC actually doesn't get to the line all that often, which shocks me, but it's because SGA averages 8 free throws a game. Nobody else is above 3.5 free throws per game except for Chet, who's out and has only played in 10 games. He averages 5 free throw attempts per game. Jalen Williams is next most with 3.3. So if you can avoid fouling SGA like crazy, they're not going to get to the line. So if you can defend SGA as much as you can without fouling, make somebody else beat you, they're not going to draw fouls with anybody else. And for the Wolves, it's going to be really hard to not turn the ball over against a team like OKC, and given the problems that Minnesota's had turning the ball over this season. But that is the biggest thing, that if they can do that, if they can keep this thing to a reasonable number of turnovers, they can legit win this. I actually don't mind the matchup with OKC. I'm not dumb. I know they're really good, but matchup-wise, like, they match up better with OKC than they do against, like, Dallas, or at least certainly than last year's Dallas team. I'm jury's still out a bit on my take on this year's Dallas team, but I do think the Wolves OKC matchup is a good one. It's not terrible for Minnesota. We saw these teams last year play a bunch of really good games. Of course, the Wolves knocked them out of the play-in 2 years ago. But SGA is, with no Chet, especially even with Chet, it's all about SGA. What can you do to slow him down and force Jalen Williams and all the other guys to beat you? Of course, this team with all their depth that they have, and Alex Caruso hasn't played. That's obviously a huge injury too for them. He's a big part of what they do from a defensive standpoint, from a flying around and making your life miserable standpoint. But I actually don't hate the matchup overall for the Wolves. So that is Tuesday night. We'll have the live postcast for you. It should be our guys, Luke Inman and Jack Borman, again, live on Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube after every Timberwolves game. And then I'll have that audio for you right here at Locked On Wolves. And then I'll be back on Wednesday with the post-game podcast after Wolves Thunder. I was just looking. There's actually no line on FanDuel yet for this one either. So go check that out on FanDuel as well. Here, I'm sure after Monday night's games, there will be a line. So go check that out. And then we'll see you over at Locked On Sports Minnesota for the postcast following the game. Then back here for the postgame pod on bright and early on Wednesday. Maybe not that early. It's New Year's Day. But Wednesday morning, for sure, you'll find that here at Locked On Wolves. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show's free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch in the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And a reminder that you can sign up for the daily newsletter over at LockedOnDaily.com. It's one stop for ultimate Wolves coverage, ultimate league coverage, delivered right to your inbox daily. Again, LockedOnDaily.com. Of course, Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.